All right, we just finished talking about equity financing. Let's talk about debt financing. Now, debt financing is simply where the corporation borrows money, right? And the people who lend money to the corporation are creditors, and they are fixed claimants. The economic term for them are fixed claimants. There are three basic ways that a corporation can borrow money. One, the corporation can borrow money from one of its current shareholders. This usually happens in the closely held corporation context. A corporation can borrow money from a bank. This happens either in the closely held business or in the large public company. Or the company can issue debt securities. Let's talk a little bit about the details of each of these. So imagine I am a shareholder in a corporation. Naturally, I've invested some capital into the corporation in exchange for my shareholdings. But if the corporation needs some more money, I might lend money to the corporation. And the corporation would usually issue a promissory note, sign and issue a promissory note in exchange for the money I lend to the corporation. We might also engage in traditional borrowing from a bank. And traditional borrowing from the bank, as you know, involves signing a loan agreement and signing a promissory note. In the context of the closely held corporation, however, the bank will often ask the shareholders, one of the shareholders or all of the shareholders of the closely held corporation, to co-sign the loan or guarantee the loan. So imagine you're a bank and a closely held corporation comes into the bank and says, we'd like to borrow money from you. Well, this corporation might be a new business. It might not have good credit. It might have no credit. And so you're not apt to lend money to this closely held corporation. But if the shareholders have good credit, you might say, okay, I will lend the money to the corporation as long as the shareholders act as co-signers. They are co-obligors with the company. Or if the shareholders guarantee the loan. In other words, if the corporation defaults on the loan, the shareholders will be responsible. This is very common in the context of the closely held corporation. Finally, the corporation might issue debt securities to the market. We'll talk about that in detail in the next slide. All right, so let's talk about debt securities. And debt securities are probably best understood through an illustration. Excuse me. Let's assume that our company needs $300 million. To do so, it issues 300,000 bonds. And we're going to use this term bonds very loosely. You've probably heard of corporate bonds. Corporate bonds are just debt securities. Sometimes we use the term bonds to describe all types of debt securities, and that's what we're going to do now. So our company, our corporation, issues 300,000 bonds. Each of the bonds has a $1,000 face value, which is the principal, right? 1,000 times 300,000 is going to give us our $300 million. And let's say that this bond has a 10% interest rate. The interest rate will vary with each bond and with each company depending on the market conditions. And once again, let's say that this corporate bond has a 5-year maturity, which means at the end of the 5 years, the company will pay back the principal. This is a corporate bond. In other words, the company, instead of borrowing $300 million from one lender, is borrowing $300 million from the market, various different lenders. One lender might buy several bonds, right? One lender might buy $100,000 worth of these bonds. Another lender might borrow another lender might buy 1 or 2 of these bonds. Right? So we're going to have many different lenders, and these lenders are called debt holders or bond holders, but they are nonetheless all creditors of the corporation. Now, these are often called coupon bonds, and that's because they used to really have coupons. There used to be a bond certificate, and it used to have these little perforated coupons, and you'd tear off one of the coupons. If you were a debt holder or bond holder, you'd tear off the coupon and you'd send it into the company. And when the company received that, they would send you back your interest payment, and you'd keep doing that until all the interest had been paid, and then you had the certificate, and at the end you'd send back the certificate to the company, and the company would then send you back the principal, in this case $1,000. So in our little example, each of the coupons would be a $50 interest payment each year, and actually we might have 4 of those each year, right? So it wouldn't be a $50 one interest payment each year, it'd be a coupon for each quarter. And at the end, the company would repay the $1,000 principal. All right, let's continue talking about the different types of debt securities. Now, we refer to these generally as debt securities or quote unquote corporate bonds, but there are different designations. So the market typically divides corporate bonds or debt securities into 3 different types. There's no law saying that they must be divided into these 3 different types. This is just what the market expects when you use these terms. So the first one is called a bond, a corporate bond. And a corporate bond, if someone says it's this debt security is a bond, it usually means it is secured by collateral. What collateral? Well, it's usually the company's assets, right? You understand the idea of a security interest. If you go to a bank and you borrow money from the bank might say, well, we need some collateral. We need your house as collateral. We need your car as collateral, right? So the same thing happens when we issue a bond. The market says, we will lend money to you, but we need some sort of collateral. And that collateral is usually one or all of the assets of the company. Bonds generally mean some sort of long-term secured debt security, 10 to 30 years. Debentures are unsecured debt securities. There is no collateral, and they are long-term, usually long-term, 10 to 30 years. Finally, we have notes. And notes are either secured or unsecured. You might ask, how do I know if a note is secured or unsecured? Well, usually they're labeled secured notes or unsecured notes, so that makes it easy. And notes are usually short-term debt securities, less than 10 years. Now, one very interesting thing about anytime a company issues debt securities to the market, there will be an indenture agreement with a trustee. And you might say, what the heck is an indenture agreement? It's just called an indenture agreement. It's just an agreement with a trustee. These bondholders have a massive collective action problem. So imagine we go back to our hypothetical. Our company is raising $300 million by issuing 300,000 bonds. These bonds are going to be bought by various investors in the market. There might be 10,000 investors who buy these bonds. What if the corporation doesn't make an interest payment? Which one of these investors, which one of these debt holders, these bondholders, is now going to take the lead and go fight for all of the bondholder rights with the corporation, right? There's a collective action problem, there's a free rider problem, and that is solved by having a trustee. A trustee will represent the interests of the debt holders with the corporation.